Quantum Leap was a television show that ran for 97 episodes at NBC from 1989 through 1993, and it very much fit the definition of a cult classic. It was a show with an unusual premise, a good heart, and a very dedicated fan base that clamored for a revival starting pretty much the day the show ended. Nearly 30 years later, the revival finally happened, with Quantum Leap returning to the airwaves in 2022. It was a show with an established history, a passionate and dedicated fan base, and a clear path to success. Perhaps never a ratings topper, but certainly there was enough there for the show to be a long-running, moderate success. Yet, after just 2 seasons and 31 episodes, the revival was canceled. So, why did the new Quantum Leap fail? Well, the original Quantum Leap starred Scott Bakula as Dr. Sam Beckett, the inventor of the eponymous time travel project, and Dean Stockwell as Admiral Al Calavici, Sam's best friend and only contact with the present day during his travels. The series concept is that each episode Sam leaps into someone, replacing them, basically looking and sounding like them, essentially living as them for a few days without anyone else noticing. His leaps direct him to places and events where something's going to go wrong, a death, a kidnapping, an innocent person framed, some mistake that compromises someone's life or changes the course of what's going to happen to them. Some negative event is going to occur, and Sam, with knowledge provided by Al from the future, works to correct it. Series creator Donald Bellisario reportedly created the show as a backdoor anthology series. The show, with a few exceptions, restricted Sam's leaps to his own lifetime, eventually setting his birth year as 1953, as Bellisario wanted the show to focus on smaller and somewhat more contemporary events, everyday people, not major events throughout history. He explicitly stated at the start of the show that the show would never go to big events like the Civil War or the JFK assassination, though it did do both of those things in its final season. But for the most part, the focus was ordinary people with relatively ordinary problems. And the show was very good at this. One of the most popular episodes was titled Jimmy, where Sam leaped into the title character, a man with Down syndrome who was going to be sent to an institution where he would pass away if Sam couldn't find him acceptance with his coworkers and with his family, specifically his sister-in-law. No villains, no crimes, no violence, really no bad guys, just people in a real situation. A story about bigotry, about accepting people who they are, people who are different as who they are. This remains one of the show's most popular episodes. Another somewhat famous or infamous episode is Running for Honor, about an honor roll cadet at a Naval Academy who may have been gay. The episode was written and broadcast even before Don't Ask, Don't Tell was a thing. The show lost a 6-figure sponsorship from an advertiser that didn't want their product associated with tolerance of gays in the military. The episode ended with Al wondering if the person Sam leaped into was actually gay, and Sam asked, "Does it matter?" Which is really the most appropriate response to that question. The fact that the new show did an episode about non-binary players in high school sports and no one even really noticed or cared is a definite sign of progress. But this is why Quantum Leap is still largely viewed so positively by so many people. Even when cheesy or preachy, which it definitely was at times, the show stood against hatred of all types. They did episodes against homophobia, against racism, against sexism. Even when they missed the mark by a bit, their hearts were always in the right place. And after 5 seasons, the show ended with one of the least satisfying series finales ever, a very surreal episode where Sam leaps as himself instead of into someone on the date of his birth, surrounded by people with faces he knows from previous leaps, even though they're different people, and a bartender who knows who Sam is and what he does. It made very little sense and raised far more questions than it answered, and it ended with a series of title cards that ended with a simple declaration that Sam Beckett never returned home. It was anticlimactic and unsatisfying, and they even misspelled Beckett on the title card, and that was the end of the show. In the years that followed, series creator Bellisario did talk about trying to revive the series. The Sci-Fi Network, however they were spelling their name at that point, was interested in doing a series with Al returning to help a new leaper, Sam's daughter. There was even an entry on the Internet Movie Database for a number of years for this production with the hopefully only working title, Quantum Leap, A Bold Leap Forward. But that eventually fell through and Sam remained in limbo. Years passed. decades passed. Dean Stockwell retired from acting after a stroke and passed away in 2021. And then, not long after, word came out that there would be a new Quantum Leap series. It was a revival, not a reboot, so the original series was still part of the series' history. Scott Bakula declined to be involved, so the series would involve entirely new characters. And one of the big changes was that the project, rarely seen in the original show, would figure prominently in the new one. This was highlighted in part by casting. In addition to the Leaper, Raymond Lee as Ben Song, and the Observer, Caitlin Bassett as Addison Augustine, they also cast 3 project members. Ernie Hudson played Herbert Magic Williams, who Sam leaped into in the original show to ultimately save his brother's life in Vietnam. Nanrisa Lee was cast as Jen Chow, the project's head of security, and boy did the show do her dirty, which I'll get to later. And Mason Alexander Park played Ian Wright, the chief technician of the project. Counting Addison as half with the Leaps and half with the project, that puts the 5 cast members at 1.5 for the Leaps versus 3.5 for the project, which played into one of the new show's larger problems. But before we get to the negatives, I do want to go over a few positives. I did like some of how they loosened restrictions on the original show. The original mostly restricted leaps to within Sam's lifetime, while the new show let Ben leap without limit. He leaped to the 1600s, he leaped to the future, he leaped without any of the previous restrictions, which generally was a good thing. At least they didn't overdo it too much. I also liked how different people could visit Ben in the imaging chamber. In the original, Al was the only person who was able to contact Sam. But in the new show, if Addison wasn't available or whatever, any other member of the project could step in, and they all did at various times. Given other alterations in the format from the original to the new, I think that was a good change. And I liked the casting. I mean, I really liked the casting. I did read the occasional complaint that there were no white men in the cast, but I honestly could not care less about that. Cast people who are good in the roles, and don't worry about the rest. Ernie Hudson is always solid and brought a strength in his role of overseeing the project and its various problems that I did appreciate, and he was very well cast in the role. Nanrisa Lee, when not hampered by the structure of the show, did a good job with her character and the opportunities presented. An episode where she had to confront issues with her family comes to mind. The standout to me was Mason Alexander Park. The role was the most interesting, and not only did the show cast a great actor in the role, they cast a non-binary actor to play a non-binary role. And outside of one episode that was openly, explicitly about trans rights, I don't think that was brought up at all. They were simply a member of the team. It doesn't matter indeed. The show demonstrating a continued commitment to standing against bigotry and intolerance and showing acceptance, and on a level that never would have been considered on the original show, is genuinely fantastic. And that episode about transgender rights, titled Let Them Play, was one of the standouts of the series. At one point, I felt that citing suicide statistics of transgender individuals was maybe a touch heavy-handed, but then I realized that, one, it's important to make that fact explicitly clear to people who have never considered the issue or its realities before, and two, the episode was written and directed by a non-binary individual and a transgender activist, and when they're telling a story that draws directly from their life experiences, it's not my job to question whether they're telling it wrong. It's my job to shut up and listen and hopefully learn something in the process. That episode was followed by Family Style, directed by Deborah Pratt from the original show, about an Indian family trying to save their restaurant, which presented one of the more detailed and three-dimensional families that Ben encountered on his various leaps. And that was followed by SOS, an episode that involved Addison learning that her father's military career ended because he took the fall for his commanding officer in a mistake that he made in a military operation. This was arguably the best stretch of episodes that the new series produced, and it led me to believe that the show, after the rough start that's very typical of new shows, especially ones with atypical premises, was going to find its way to realizing its potential. Unfortunately, that didn't really happen, and I think there are two major reasons for that, both of which involve the fundamental structure of the show. And the first one's going to sound ridiculous on the surface, but I truly believe it was a critical misfire the show didn't recover from. And that decision was to eliminate the concept of the waiting room. See, the mechanics of the project weren't nailed down when the show started and tended to be kind of ambiguous and even change over time as the story required, because they weren't really important to the stories told. But as time went on, they settled on the idea that when Sam leaped into someone in the past looking like them, that person ended up at the project in what they called the waiting room, looking like Sam. The people of the project could work with the person, figure out where Sam was, learn details about the person's life that wouldn't be in official records to help them determine what Sam had to do, and so on. This was rarely seen, but in the last season there were a few times where Al worked with the person in the waiting room, helping them directly and occasionally trying to stop self-destructive behaviors, because if that person's behavior is a large part of the problem, they need to be helped, or else the problem will continue when they get back, as anyone who's dealt with bullheaded or obstinate people will know. When I read that the new show would feature the project prominently, I thought this was a great thing. The show would be able to work the leaps on both ends, and we get not just the leaper's perspective on events, with Sam, but also the leapee at the project, and they'd be able to coordinate and so on. But the decision was made to eliminate the waiting room in the revival. One of the behind-the-scenes creative staff involved with the show stated the concept never made any sense to them, and so they just got rid of it. This really was the biggest unforced error of the revival, because with that decision, they completely divorced the project from the leaps. The only thing that the project could do to contribute would be to research information, and we didn't need to see that. We never did before. It wasn't necessary. Whatever they found, Al reported to Sam, and that was all the stories required. So with the link to the leaps largely severed, they had to figure out different things for the project and for the 2/3 of the cast that were regularly restricted to the project to do. So the first season involved an ongoing security threat to the project, which seemed to be spearheaded by Al's daughter Janice, and they had problem after problem as Janice ran circles around them, but it was never clear what was going on. They finally captured her in the second half of the season, and I figured they'd finally tell us what was going on and what the problem was, but instead she gave this urgent "don't trust anyone" speech that clarified nothing while dramatic music played, and that was the first time this show made me say, "Oh, come on," at my screen. It's a very risky approach to keep your serialized season-long plot a secret from the audience for most of the season, if you want them to care about it, and Quantum Leap just didn't pull it off at all. Now, they did eventually find out what was going on with the other leaper. Did I mention that there was someone else sleeping around who Ben kept running into? I don't think I did, but that was happening too. And they dealt with that, and then they went on to season 2, where it only took 2 or 3 episodes to discover that huge amounts of data were being transmitted out of the project to locations unknown, and another attack shut the program down, and all of this seems very familiar. See, the project was rarely seen in the original show, which made it mysterious and intriguing. But once we started spending about half of every episode there, the dirty little secret was revealed. The project is profoundly uninteresting. In the new show, it was constantly under siege from outside forces that generally wanted to control the project to get revenge on project members. Seriously, that is essentially the serialized plot of both seasons. 2 different, unrelated, independent individuals each tried to wrest control of the project away from Magic and his team for their own ends. But there's not a lot of other options for what to do when, again, the project is so completely divorced from the leaps. So the project was always under siege, which is why I suggested earlier that Nanresa Lee got the short end of the stick. Her character is head of security, and if the show is about the project constantly being in danger from outside sources, then the very structure of the show requires her to be incredibly incapable of doing her job, because if she does her job effectively, there's no threat. So she has to fail to catch people attacking the project, and she has to miss opportunities, and she has to spend all of her time playing catch-up while the people who are causing the problems continue to get away time after time. She and Magic once spent half an episode trapped in an elevator because the entire project had been compromised, and Ian had to spend hours clearing the systems and rebooting everything. It makes the project look bad, and it makes her look bad. But this is what the new show gave us, which is kind of a tragedy, because the second major reason why the show failed is that the new Quantum Leap really did not care about the leaps. Now, comparisons between the two versions of the show are inevitable, and I have tried not to judge the new show based on the previous one, but this is another fundamental issue that needs to be addressed. The original show stuck with Sam. He was in almost every scene of every episode for 5 full seasons, and each episode was a total immersion into someone else's life. The show had 45 minutes to introduce characters, establish relationships, determine what Sam was there to fix, and then actually tell the story. There was a lot of ground to cover each episode and very little time to do it, so every moment was important. Some resolutions or character epiphanies could seem rushed, but that is the nature of episodic network television. So to speed things along a little bit, every episode began with the title and the exact date, so you immediately had some context to work with. And each episode ended with Sam leaping to a new location and giving a teaser of what the next episode would be to draw you back the next week. The new show is 42 minutes per episode, and there's no exact timekeeping here, but you figure about half of each of that 42 minutes was spent at the project because of the way the show was split between the two settings. So now the leads barely get 20 minutes per episode, which means we barely get to spend any time with the people Ben is helping, people who we are supposed to care about. They don't show us a title, they don't tell us a date, sometimes we don't even know the year. They rarely did teasers for the next episode. We mostly would be introduced at the beginning of the episode to the new situation. Ben would learn what was going on, quickly sort it out, and then move on. Now, earlier when I went over the cast, I specifically did not mention Lee and Bissett as Ben and Addison. I want to be fair to them, and I'm still not 100% sure that I am, because they are the analogs to Sam and Al, so direct comparisons are very easy to make. But again, I don't want to judge the new based on the old. That's not fair to anyone. Lee and Bissett are different actors playing different roles and should not be beholden to what Bakula and Stockwell did. And Bakula and Stockwell had incredible chemistry, the sort that you just can't plan for or create or manufacture. It has to happen spontaneously. The two of them became such good friends that Stockwell kept showing up on every series Bakula was a lead on later on in his career just to get them on screen together again. Lee and Bissett did not have that chemistry, it's fine. I mean, you can't expect that. You can't manufacture that. But it did leave me with a potentially unfair feeling that while Sam and Al were friends, Ben and Addison were just co-workers, which worked against accepting that the characters were engaged. I have trouble reconciling a theoretically stronger relationship against the lesser chemistry that the actors had. It's unintentional, but it's there, and I can't shake it. I'm also not sure how much of my issues with them are on them and how much is the writing, because honestly, they really weren't bad in the roles, and I don't want to imply that they are. I really do think that the problem was more the writing. When you only have 20 or 25 minutes of screen time for the leap, there's not room for a lot of back and forth, so Ben would frequently go into a stilted, inspirational, hope-giving, righteous speech part that would change people's life views and solve the situation in one go. I mean, that's kind of a sarcastic description there, but it often felt to me like the episode would reach the here's where we resolve the leap, let's get back to the project moment. And the delivery was often bad, like forced. It didn't feel like it was something that the character was saying naturally. But actors can only work with the material they've been given, so I can't fault Raymond Lee for not being able to knock a scene out of the park or give it a strong emotional punch when there's nothing at the heart of the scene to elevate. People don't change lifelong perspectives just because someone says, have you considered you're being unreasonable? Try this instead. It's just a weak way to try to resolve the issues of characters the audience doesn't have reason to care about. Because Quantum Leap is an anthology series, but the focus on the project is a serialized story, and you can't mix those. There's no such thing as a serialized anthology. When you have a series of one-and-done stories sharing space with a season-long story, the show inevitably becomes entirely about the season-long story, which is the antithesis of what Quantum Leap originally was. The only time the original series did a story about a threat to the project's existence was the second season premiere, where Al had to attend hearings to secure funding for the project. And they only did that episode because the first season was a few episodes as a mid-season replacement, and once they got picked up for a full season, they had to introduce the concept to a new audience. So the threat to the project was a way to help explain what was going on to people who weren't familiar with it. Once that was done, they never went back to that well again. The new series did it as a matter of course. It was almost every episode. Both seasons of the new show were about threats to the project. Honestly, it wouldn't have surprised me if a hypothetical third season would have been about Sam's brother Tom showing up and trying to shut down the project to keep them from losing more people in the time, the same way that they lost his brother. That's the world they kept going back to, and it's really not an interesting or entertaining one. That's why the best episodes, including the ones I referred to earlier as the best stretch of the series, were episodes that focused primarily on the leaps rather than the project, and were set up so that what was happening at the project, the conversations the characters had and so on, pertained directly to the leaps. The new show worked when it focused on the leaps and when it only tried to tell one story per episode. It failed when it dedicated itself to project lore, which was almost always, and again, was not particularly interesting overall. And one last thing that I need to get off my chest about the show, and I admit that I may be overreacting on this one, but it's the point fairly early in the second season where I pretty much gave up on the show. So here it is. I just knew when I heard that Ben and Addison, the two main characters, were engaged, that this was eventually going to be used for some contrived character conflict, and they waited all the way up to season 2 to jump into that well. Consider that this show removed all of the restrictions on the original. There were no limits to what years Ben could leap to. This show's very concept opened up everywhere, everywhen. The entirety of all of human history could be the setting for an episode. They could tell literally any story they wanted, anywhere, no restrictions, no limitations. No other show on television has such a wide open canvas to work with. And when the creative staff developed the plot lines for season 2, what did they go with? On one side, another series of attacks on the project. On the other, the two leads have relationship issues and start seeing other people. Quantum Leap, ladies and gentlemen. What a waste. Quantum Leap was always a show about empathy. Watching Sam Beckett, a white man from a relatively privileged background, live other people's lives and experiences in a way that was generally eye-opening. Depending on who he leaped into, he was the target of homophobia, of sexism, of misogyny, of racism. And seeing it on television directed at a white man put those things into perspective in a unique way, casting it in a new and different light than usual, and helping to expose these bigotries for what they were and showing how ridiculous they were. And that's what the show did well. It was a show about people and their experiences. The new show was more about the project. I mean, it dealt with issues during the leaps, but often without enough time to make any impact or get into much depth on it. And the show didn't run long enough to clean up the excess and focus on what mattered. There was an interview I read after the first season was completed. I read it, but I'm unable to find it now, where some people were involved with the show were talking about fan feedback that they had heard about, and they said they were surprised. Surprised was the word that was used. They were surprised that fans wanted much stronger focus on the leaps, which made me wonder what show these people thought they were doing exactly. They revived a show with a dedicated following, a pre-existing built-in audience, a show that was 100% about a person entering people's lives to improve them, and they were surprised that people wanted the show to focus on that. Apparently, much of the creative staff thought the project was the point of the show. And the new show did have its moments, but not nearly enough of them. And that, in a nutshell, is why the new Quantum Leap failed. The original show, the original Quantum Leap, was about Dr. Sam Beckett leaping from life to life, striving to put right what once went wrong. And the revived Quantum Leap was about politics, intrigue, and sabotage at a government-run time travel project. I know which one sounds more interesting to me. And so the new Quantum Leap disappears into the night, barely having made an impact, and will likely be remembered as little more than yet another attempt to cash in on an original that failed to understand and capitalize on what was so good about the original, what made the show endure and still be remembered fondly nearly 30 years after it went off the air. And it's a shame because in this day and age, we really could use more voices of tolerance and understanding. And because the show had a lot going for it, all the potential in the world, and they pretty much completely wasted it. So, no more Quantum Leap, no more reason to care. I guess really in the end, it doesn't matter. It's just a TV show. Life goes on. And now we truly never will find out what happened to Sam Beckett. Damn it.